My name is Andrew Collins, and up until the night my wife tried to end our marriage in front of everyone, I believed I was a man who had done everything right. I'm 38 years old, work as a senior project manager for a commercial construction firm in Oxford, and I spent most of my adult life building things meant to last: office complexes, medical facilities, and what I thought was a solid, unbreakable family. I'm not flashy or loud, not the kind of man who demands attention when he walks into a room. I've always believed consistency mattered more than charm, and loyalty mattered more than excitement. That belief shaped how I loved my wife, how I treated my family, and how blind I was to what was quietly happening behind my back. I met my wife, Laura Collins, when I was 29 and she was 26. We married 3 years later, standing under a white tent in her parents' backyard, convinced we were starting a life built on honesty and partnership. I remember thinking, even then, that I was lucky to have a woman who laughed easily, who knew how to soften a room, who told everyone I was a rock. We had been married just over 6 years by the time of that family dinner, and although our marriage had grown quieter, I believed that was normal. No screaming fights, no dramatic breakups, just distance I assumed came from routine and stress. What I didn't realize was that silence can hide more betrayal than shouting ever could. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. The dinner was Laura's idea, which should have been my first warning sign. She insisted it be a full family night, inviting both her parents, her younger sister, my older brother, and even a couple of cousins who rarely showed up unless there was something worth watching. She told me it would be good for us, that we hadn't all been together in a while. I noticed how carefully she dressed that evening, how she kept checking her reflection, how nervous energy clung to her smile. I mistook it for anxiety about hosting, not preparation for what she had planned. I spent the afternoon grilling steaks, setting the table, playing the role of the dependable husband I'd always been. As everyone gathered around the long oak dining table, the atmosphere felt strange but not explosive. There was laughter, polite conversation, glasses clinking. Laura barely touched her food, which again I misread as nerves. Her father talked about work. My brother joked about old memories, and I sat there thinking how normal it all looked. What I didn't know was that Laura had already decided this dinner would be the stage for her exit. She wanted witnesses. She wanted control of the narrative. She wanted me stunned and silent while she rewrote our marriage in a single rehearsed speech. And for a brief moment, she almost got exactly that. Halfway through the meal, Laura set her fork down and cleared her throat. The room quieted instantly, like everyone instinctively sensed something important was coming. She didn't look at me at first. Instead, she looked at the table, then at her parents, then finally at the rest of the room. When she spoke, her voice was steady, practiced, almost attached. She said she had something to say, something she'd been holding in for a long time. Then she turned to me and said the words that made my chest tighten. She was leaving me. Not privately, not gently, but in front of everyone I loved, as if our marriage was a performance she was done pretending to enjoy. She said she'd been unhappy for years. She said I was emotionally distant, too focused on work, not present enough as a husband. She implied she had sacrificed parts of herself to make our marriage work, while I barely noticed. Head slowly turned toward me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to either beg or explode. I felt the weight of judgment settle in the room, the quiet agreement forming before I had spoken a single word. Laura believed she had already won. She believed she had framed the story so perfectly that I would walk away as the villain who never saw it coming. What Laura didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. I hadn't planned it for a family dinner, but I had known something was wrong long before she opened her mouth. Late nights, secretive messages, changes in routine, excuses that didn't quite add up. I hadn't confronted her, not because I was weak, but because I wanted the truth in full, undeniable detail. I wanted proof, not suspicion. And sitting quietly beside my plate that night, inside a plain manila envelope I brought with me, was the evidence she never expected to face publicly. When Laura finally finished speaking, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and relief, as if she believed I was already defeated. The room waited. My brother shifted uncomfortably. Her mother looked close to tears. I slowly reached down beside my chair, picked up the envelope, and placed it gently on the table in front of Laura. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I simply said, "Before you leave, you should open this." The moment her fingers touched the envelope, the confident smile on her face vanished. And as the first page slid out and everyone leaned in, the room went completely silent, frozen in a way no one there would ever forget. The envelope sat between us like a live wire, and for a few long seconds Laura didn't move. I could see it in her eyes before she even opened it, the realization that this dinner was no longer hers to control. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out the first page, and the room leaned forward as if drawn by gravity. The sound of paper sliding against paper was painfully loud in the sudden silence. I watched her face drain of color as she scanned the page, her lips parting without sound. Around us, everyone waited for me to explain myself, but I stayed quiet. I wanted them to see it for themselves. I wanted Laura to feel, just for once, what it was like to be exposed without preparation. That first document was a detailed phone log, printed and highlighted, showing months of late-night calls and messages between Laura and a number saved under a woman's name I didn't recognize. Her sister frowned, leaning closer, while my brother's jaw tightened as he read over her shoulder. Laura tried to speak, but no words came out. I could see the excuses forming in her mind, collapsing before they ever reached her mouth. I explained calmly, still seated, that the number belonged to a man named Stephen Wright, someone Laura had told me was just a client she met through a charity committee. I explained that the calls weren't occasional or accidental, but consistent, intimate, and carefully hidden. Every line of that paper represented a lie she had told with ease. The second document was harder for her to look at. It was a series of printed photographs, time-stamped and unmistakably clear, taken over several weeks. Laura and Stephen sitting too close in a restaurant booth. Laura laughing with her hand resting on his thigh. Laura entering a hotel with him on a weekday afternoon when she told me she was working late. Her mother gasped quietly, covering her mouth, while her father stared at the table like it might swallow him whole. I didn't feel satisfaction watching their reactions, only a heavy calm. I had already processed this pain alone. This moment wasn't about hurting them. It was about stripping away the false version of my wife they were being asked to defend. Laura finally pushed her chair back slightly, shaking her head over and over as if denial might erase the evidence. She tried to say my name, but her voice cracked, and she stopped. I told her she didn't need to explain herself anymore, that she had already done enough talking. I reminded the room, slowly and clearly, that this dinner had been her idea, that she chose this audience, that she decided our marriage deserved a public ending. I said I had planned to handle things privately, legally, with dignity, but since she wanted witnesses, I felt it was only fair they heard the whole truth. No editing, no emotional spin, just facts. I explained how I had started noticing the changes nearly a year earlier. The guarded phone, the sudden interest in her appearance, the emotional distance disguised as independence. I explained how I hired a private investigator not out of jealousy, but out of necessity, because trust without honesty is just self-deception. Every word I spoke felt measured, deliberate, not fueled by anger but by clarity. Laura sank back into her chair as I spoke, her posture collapsing as the image she had carefully constructed unraveled in real time. The woman who had planned to walk out empowered now looked cornered and exposed, unable to rewrite what had already been proven. What hurt her the most wasn't the evidence itself. It was realizing I had known for months and said nothing, that I had watched, waited, and prepared while she believed I was oblivious. I told her I stayed silent because I wanted to understand who she had become, not just what she had done. I want to be certain that ending our marriage was the right choice, not a reaction to suspicion. I told her that every late night she chose him, every lie she rehearsed, had made my decision easier. By the time she announced she was leaving, I had already let go of the man who would have begged her to stay. The room felt heavier with every sentence. No one interrupted. No one defended her. Her sister stared at her with disappointment instead of sympathy. Her father looked older somehow, smaller. My brother placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me in the moment. I realized then that revenge didn't always need shouting or destruction. Sometimes it was simply allowing the truth to stand tall where lies expected to rule. Laura had planned to humiliate me, to paint herself as brave and long-suffering. Instead, she sat surrounded by the wreckage of her own choices, watching the respect she took for granted slip quietly away. When I finally stopped speaking, I told Laura she was free to leave, just as she wanted. I told her I wouldn't stop her, wouldn't chase her, and wouldn't argue. But I also told her that from this moment on, I would no longer protect her image or her secrets. The consequences would unfold naturally, legally, and completely. I stood up, collected the remaining documents, and thanked everyone for coming. No anger, no drama, just finality. As Laura stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes, I understood something clearly for the first time since all this began. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of hers, and she was utterly unprepared for what came next. The days after that dinner passed in a strange, muffled haze, like the world had been wrapped in cotton to soften the blow of reality. Laura moved out within 48 hours, taking only what she could fit into 2 suitcases, avoiding eye contact as if looking at me might force her to confront what she'd lost. I didn't stop her or ask where she was going. By then, I had already changed the locks, separated our accounts, and notified my attorney that the moment we discussed had arrived. I took time off work, not because I was falling apart, but because I needed space to think clearly. Revenge, I'd learned, wasn't about rage. It was about patience, timing, and making sure every step forward was deliberate. What surprised me most wasn't Laura's silence, but how quickly the narrative she'd built collapsed without me lifting a finger. Word traveled fast through family circles, friend groups, and even professional connections we shared. People who once smiled politely at me now called, messaged, or stopped by with awkward apologies for believing her version of events. I never gloated. I never shared details beyond what had already been revealed. The truth didn't need embellishment. Laura's sudden disappearance from social events, her abrupt resignation from the charity committee, and her strained relationship with her parents spoke louder than any explanation I could have offered. The image she curated so carefully had shattered, and there was no graceful way to glue it back together. At work, I found an unexpected sense of grounding. Construction had always been simple to me: plans, execution, accountability. Unlike marriage, there was no pretending when a foundation was cracked. My colleagues noticed a change, but not weakness. If anything, I was sharper, more focused. I poured myself into projects, staying late not to escape loneliness, but to rebuild a sense of purpose that had been quietly eroded over years of compromise. I realized how much of myself I had folded away to keep peace at home, how often I had accepted emotional distance as maturity. That awareness fueled me. I wasn't rebuilding to spite Laura. I was rebuilding because I finally understood my own worth. The legal process began with calm efficiency, exactly how I wanted it. My attorney confirmed what the evidence already suggested. Laura's affair wasn't just a betrayal of trust, but a significant factor in how assets would be divided. I didn't push for cruelty. I pushed for fairness, which, under the circumstances, leaned heavily in my favor. Laura attempted to negotiate through her lawyer, offering compromises that might have worked months earlier. Now they sounded hollow. Every proposal felt like a delayed apology disguised as practicality. I declined anything that suggested shared ownership or lingering ties. Clean breaks heal faster. I wasn't interested in winning arguments. I was interested in closing doors. It wasn't until Laura finally called me weeks later that I felt the first true test of my resolve. Her voice was softer than I remembered, stripped of confidence and certainty. She said she hadn't realized how serious things had become, how quickly everything had fallen apart. She said she missed our life, our routines, even the quiet moments she once complained about. I listened without interrupting, without emotion spilling into my tone. When she finished, I told her the truth she hadn't expected to hear, that I didn't hate her. Hate would have meant she still mattered in the way she wanted. What I felt instead was clarity. And clarity doesn't negotiate with regret. After that call, I understood something essential about revenge that most people get wrong. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. Real revenge is living well, without needing validation from the person who wronged you. Laura expected anger, bitterness, maybe even desperation. What she got was indifference paired with accountability. I followed through on every boundary I set, every decision I made, without wavering. She lost access to my life, my future, and the version of me she once controlled. That loss wasn't dramatic, but it was permanent. And permanence, I learned, cuts deeper than any argument ever could. Family gatherings shifted after that. Laura's absence was noticeable, uncomfortable, but no one questioned why. Conversations flowed more honestly. I stopped filtering myself, stopped defending choices I didn't need to explain. My brother told me one evening that he admired how I handled everything, how I never tried to destroy her publicly even when I could have. I told him destruction was easy. Discipline was harder. What I wanted wasn't her suffering. It was her understanding that actions have weight, and once released, they don't float back gently. They land where they're meant to, whether you're ready or not. By the time the divorce papers were finalized, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not relieved in a celebratory way, but steady, grounded, complete. I stood alone in a house that once felt like a shared space and realized it finally belonged to me again, not just legally, but emotionally. Laura had taken years of certainty with her when she left, but she'd also given me something invaluable in return: freedom from illusion. And as I began planning the next chapter of my life, I knew this story wasn't about what she'd done to me anymore. It was about what I would do next, now that nothing was holding me back. By the time the ink dried on the divorce papers, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. What followed wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was far more revealing than the confrontation at that dinner table. Laura had always believed consequences were things that happened to other people, especially people without her charm or connections. She had built her life on the assumption that no matter what she did, someone else would soften the landing. Watching that illusion collapse, slowly and methodically, taught me that patience often delivers justice more precisely than anger ever could. Laura moved into a small apartment across town, far from the neighborhoods she used to frequent. At first, she tried to maintain appearances online, posting carefully cropped photos and vague quotes about new beginnings and choosing happiness. But real life doesn't respond to captions. Invitations stopped coming. Friends who once defended her quietly distanced themselves. The charity board she'd been so proud of officially removed her after donors raised concerns about her conduct. None of this happened because I pushed for it. It happened because once the truth was visible, people made their own decisions. Laura had underestimated how much of her social standing relied on perception rather than substance. Professionally, things unraveled even faster for her. Stephen Wright, the man she risked everything for, turned out to be exactly who I suspected he was: temporary, selfish, and deeply uninterested in accountability. Once the excitement faded and reality set in, he disappeared from her life with the same ease he entered it. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had never planned to leave his own situation, never promised her a future, only escape. Laura had mistaken secrecy for intimacy, and when secrecy was no longer possible, there was nothing left holding them together. Betrayal, I realized, rarely rewards loyalty. Meanwhile, my life continued moving forward in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was offered promotion at work that required overseeing projects across multiple states, something I would have declined before without hesitation. This time I accepted. Travel gave me perspective. Being in new places, meeting new people who knew nothing about my past, reminded me that identity isn't fixed to a single chapter of your life. I wasn't the husband who was left anymore. I was simply a man building something new, brick by brick, without needing to explain what had been torn down. Laura reached out again months later, this time not with regret, but with frustration. She accused me of turning everyone against her, of enjoying her downfall, of orchestrating some quiet campaign to ruin her life. I listened, letting her vent until she ran out of words. Then I told her something she didn't want to hear, that her consequences weren't my responsibility. I didn't need to punish her. She had done that herself the moment she chose deception over honesty. The silence that followed told me she finally understood that there was no villain she could point to anymore, only a mirror she refused to look into. What struck me most was how differently I carried myself through all of this. I slept better. I laughed more freely. I stopped second-guessing my instincts. For years, I had minimized my own discomfort to keep peace, convincing myself that sacrifice was the same thing as love. Losing Laura forced me to confront that lie. Love doesn't demand erasure. It doesn't thrive on imbalance. And it certainly doesn't survive betrayal disguised as self-discovery. Understanding that didn't make me bitter. It made me honest, first with myself, then with the world. Family dynamics shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Laura's parents eventually reached out, not to apologize for her, but to acknowledge the truth they had avoided. They admitted they had ignored warning signs because it was easier than confronting reality. I appreciated their honesty, even if it came late. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it just means releasing the weight of resentment, so it doesn't follow you into the future. I wished them well, without reopening doors that needed to stay closed. One evening, standing alone on the balcony of a hotel overlooking a city skyline, I realized the revenge Laura feared wasn't something I actively pursued. It was the life I was quietly reclaiming. She had expected me to crumble, to lash out, to prove her decision justified. Instead, I grew, and growth is unsettling to people who rely on your stagnation to feel secure. My success wasn't performance meant for her to witness, but I knew she heard about it. That knowledge, I suspected, bothered her more than any argument ever could. By the end of that year, Laura was no longer a central figure in my thoughts. She existed only as a lesson, a reminder of what happens when you confuse entitlement with love. I didn't need her to suffer to feel whole. I needed distance, truth, and forward motion. And as I prepared to take the next steps of my life, new projects, new connections, new possibilities, I understood something essential. Revenge isn't about destruction. It's about refusing to be diminished by someone else's choices. And in that refusal, I found a strength I didn't know I had. I didn't expect Laura to reappear in my life in any meaningful way after everything that had happened. And for a long time, she didn't. Months passed where her name never crossed my mind unless someone else brought it up. And even then, it felt distant, like discussing a character from a book I'd already finished reading. I had settled into a new rhythm, one defined by work, travel, and a growing sense of internal calm. I was no longer reacting to loss. I was actively choosing direction. That was why, when I got the call from an unfamiliar number late one evening, her voice on the other end caught me off guard. Not because I missed it, but because it sounded nothing like the woman who once believed she controlled the outcome of our lives. She didn't start with an apology. Laura never knew how to lead with humility. Instead, she spoke about circumstances, about how things hadn't turned out the way she expected, about how life had been unfair to her since the divorce. She mentioned losing her job permanently, struggling financially, and feeling isolated from people she once thought would always stand by her. As she talked, I realized she wasn't calling for reconciliation. She was calling because she believed familiarity equaled safety, and I was the last person who had ever truly protected her from consequences. That assumption, that I would still be her fallback, revealed how deeply she had misunderstood me, even after everything. She eventually asked to meet in person, saying there were things she couldn't explain over the phone. I agreed, not out of hope or weakness, but out of closure. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our neighborhoods, a neutral place with no shared memories attached. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. The confidence was gone, replaced by tension and fatigue she couldn't mask. She spoke quickly, nervously, as if afraid I might leave at any moment, and maybe part of her knew I could. I listened, calm and attentive, the same way I would listen to a stranger recount their mistakes. Laura admitted, finally, that she had underestimated the damage her choices would cause. She said she thought freedom would feel lighter, that stepping away from responsibility would somehow make her happier. Instead, she felt exposed and unanchored, forced to confront parts of herself she'd spent years avoiding. She didn't ask me to fix anything, but she asked if I believed she was a bad person. It was the first honest question she'd asked in a long time. I told her the truth, that I didn't think she was evil, but I did think she was reckless with the people who loved her, and that recklessness had cost her dearly. What struck me during that conversation wasn't satisfaction, but clarity. I realized that the power dynamic she once relied on had completely reversed, not because I asserted dominance, but because I no longer needed anything from her. She noticed it too. She asked if I was happy, and for the first time, I answered without hesitation. I told her I was at peace, that my life felt honest now, even when it was challenging. That answer seemed to unsettle her more than anger ever could have. Happiness without her contradicted the story she told herself to justify leaving. When we parted ways, there were no promises to stay in touch, no lingering looks, no dramatic final words. Just a polite goodbye and the understanding that whatever remained between us belonged firmly in the past. Walking away from that cafe, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, a sense of completion. Not triumph, not pity, but release. I no longer carried the weight of unresolved questions or imagined outcomes. The chapter that began at that family dinner had finally closed, not with confrontation, but with understanding. In the weeks that followed, I reflected on how close I'd come to letting bitterness shape my identity. Revenge stories often glorify destruction, but what I learned was far quieter and far more lasting. True revenge isn't about watching someone fall apart. It's about refusing to let their choices dictate your future. Laura's return wasn't a test of my forgiveness. It was a test of my boundaries, and I passed it by staying exactly where I was, grounded and unmoved. As I continued building my life forward, I understood that the final reckoning wasn't hers to face anymore. It was mine to transcend. I had confronted betrayal, humiliation, and loss without becoming consumed by them. I had chosen dignity over drama, growth over resentment. And in doing so, I reclaimed something far more valuable than vindication. I reclaimed myself. Looking back now, it's strange to think how one dinner reshaped the trajectory of my life more completely than any decision I consciously made before it. The man who sat at that table, quietly placing an envelope in front of his wife, wasn't fully aware of what he was stepping into. He knew the marriage was ending, yes, but he didn't yet understand that the real transformation would happen afterward, in the quiet spaces where no one was watching. Months later, standing in my home with sunlight spilling across the floor I once shared with someone who no longer belonged there, I understood that survival wasn't the goal. Ownership of my own life was. Everything else had been stripped away, so I could finally see that clearly. I began to rebuild with intention, not urgency. I resisted the pressure to replace what I lost too quickly, whether that meant companionship, routine, or the comfort of familiarity. I learned to sit with myself, to enjoy my own company without distraction, and to listen to the instincts I had ignored for years. I reconnected with old friends I drifted from, not because Laura disliked them, but because I'd unconsciously shaped my world around keeping the peace. Those friendships reminded me of who I was before compromise became second nature. They didn't see me as a victim or a cautionary tale. They saw me as a man who had been tested and hadn't folded. Work continued to challenge me in the best possible way. The promotion I accepted led to long days in unfamiliar cities, but also gave me perspective I didn't know I needed. Each project had a clear beginning, middle, and end, something my marriage never truly had. I found satisfaction and accountability in knowing that effort led to tangible results. Unlike love built on illusion, this kind of work rewarded honesty. I thrived in that environment, not because I was escaping pain, but because I was aligned with who I actually was. Stability, I learned, doesn't come from holding on to people who don't respect you. It comes from building a life that doesn't require constant self-betrayal. People occasionally ask me if I regretted how things ended, if I wished I'd handled that dinner differently or spoken sooner. The honest answer is no. Regret implies a desire to return to something that no longer fits, and I never wanted that. What I wished for instead was clarity sooner, not for the sake of saving the marriage, but for the sake of saving myself years of doubt. But even that wish softened over time. Every experience, even the painful ones, had carried me here. And here was a place of balance, not bitterness. I wasn't proud of what Laura did, but I was proud of how I responded. I did eventually open myself up to the idea of love again, cautiously and without illusion, not because I felt incomplete alone, but because I no longer feared losing myself in someone else. I understood my boundaries now. I understood the difference between sacrifice and self-erasure. I approached new connections with honesty instead of performance, curiosity instead of expectation. There was no rush, no pressure to recreate what I'd lost. If anything, I was grateful for the patience betrayal had taught me. Trust, I learned, isn't blind faith. It's earned consistency over time. As for Laura, she faded into the background of my life in the most natural way possible. I heard occasional updates through mutual connections, but they no longer stirred emotion. She became a chapter, not a wound. I hoped she learned something from the consequences she faced, but her growth was no longer my concern. I didn't need closure from her actions or validation from her regret. The only closure that mattered was the peace I carried with me every day. That peace didn't come from revenge fulfilled, but from self-respect restored. Sometimes I replay that dinner in my mind, not with anger, but with clarity. I remember the silence, the shock, the stillness of that moment when the truth finally had nowhere left to hide. That was the night everything burned down, yes, but it was also the night something honest began. Fire as a way of clearing what's rotten, even when it hurts. What grows afterward depends on what you choose to plant. I chose integrity. I chose patience. I chose not to become smaller just because someone else betrayed me. This is where my story ends, not with applause or justice served dramatically, but with something far more enduring. I stood through humiliation without losing dignity. I faced betrayal without surrendering to cruelty. I let go without chasing validation. And in doing so, I discovered that the most powerful revenge isn't public exposure or quiet consequence. It's a life lived so fully and honestly that the person who tried to diminish you no longer has a place in it at all. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.